I've been a registered nurse for 11 years, and I've never once called in sick. Not when I had the flu so bad I could barely stand upright in the shower. Not when my father died in October of 2019 and I found out during a break between rounds and had to keep going, had to keep smiling at Mrs. Hartley in bed 4 who needed her compression socks adjusted and her dinner tray moved 2 inches to the left. Not even last February when my car slid off Route 9 in the ice and I had to wait 40 minutes in the ditch for the tow truck, then show up at St. Jude Memorial with mud on my scrubs and a bruise forming along my collarbone. I don't call in sick. I show up, I do my job, and I go home. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what I'm about to describe is not the product of an overtired mind. It is not shift fatigue or the particular dissociation that sets in around hour 9 of a 12-hour overnight when the fluorescent lights start to feel like they're breathing. I know what that feels like. I know how to recognize it. What happened at St. Jude Memorial between the 14th and the 17th of March is something else entirely, and I have spent 6 weeks trying to find a way to talk about it that doesn't make me sound like I need to be on the other side of the nurse's station. St. Jude Memorial Hospital sits at the edge of Harwick, Vermont, population roughly 4,000 if you count the seasonal people who come up from Boston to ski and then disappear again in April. It's a small hospital, 2 floors, 48 beds, a modest ICU wing, a maternity unit. The building was constructed in 1961, expanded twice in the 90s, and it shows. The linoleum in the East Corridor is a shade of institutional green that stopped being manufactured sometime during the Reagan administration. The radiators knock and hiss through winter with a sound like someone tapping politely on metal pipes from the inside. It is not a glamorous place to work, but it is a good one. I've worked the overnight shift at St. Jude for 4 years, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., Sunday through Wednesday. My usual assignment is the second-floor general medical ward, rooms 290 through 315, a stretch of corridor that curves gently around the elevator bank and smells permanently of antiseptic and industrial fabric softener. After 4 years, the overnight ward becomes a geography you carry in your body. You stop thinking about where things are. You just move. I met Elijah Thorne on the 14th of March, which was a Tuesday. I'd heard about him before I met him. Word travels fast on a floor with 30 nurses and 12 active beds, and a comatose patient with an unusual admission story is the kind of thing people mention in handoff. The day shift supervisor, Sandra Kohler, mentioned him to me in the break room at 6:45 while I was putting my dinner in the refrigerator. 302 got a new one, she said, not looking up from the chart she was annotating. Professor type. Found him in the Harwick State Forest on Sunday morning by a trail crew doing winter maintenance. No trauma, no obvious cause. Just unconscious, hypothermic, not responding. GCS of 3 when the paramedics got there. Stable since admission but no change in LOC. I asked her what the story was. She shrugged. His name is Elijah Thorne. 71 years old. Retired linguistics professor, University of Vermont, taught there almost 30 years. Lives alone since his wife died. The trail crew found him about 1.5 miles off the marked path. No tent, no gear, no visible reason to be out there. The only thing on him was a small notebook, and apparently whatever's written in it gave the admitting physician enough pause that she made a note about it in the file. I asked what was in the notebook. Sandra put down her pen and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as professionally noncommittal. The note says patient's personal effects include handwritten text in an unidentified script that may warrant review. Which is hospital speak for. Something nobody wanted to deal with at 2 in the morning. I decided it wasn't my problem. I had 11 other patients that night. Mr. Thorne in 302 was stable, monitored, and not my concern beyond routine checks. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. I did my initial round at 7:30, after handoff. Room 302 was the third to last room I checked. The door was partially open, which was standard for comatose patients. I pushed it fully open and stood for a moment while my eyes adjusted. The room was dark except for the ambient glow of monitoring equipment. The cardiac monitor showed a steady, slow rhythm, 54 beats per minute. Pulse oximeter at 96. Blood pressure 118/74. Everything exactly as it should be. Elijah Thorne lay on his back in the center of the bed, perfectly still with the kind of absolute motionlessness that comatose patients have, not the shifting stillness of deep sleep, but something more fundamental, like a photograph of a person rather than a person. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered but thin in the way of someone who had been athletic once and lost the weight of age gradually. His hair was white and somewhat long, swept back from a high forehead. His face, even slack and unresponsive, had a quality I remember noticing, an impression of strong architectural features, prominent nose, deep-set eyes, the kind of face that probably looked authoritative behind a lectern. His hands were folded on the blanket at his midsection. The foreline ran from the back of his left hand up to the drip bag. Normal saline with a trace of glucose, nothing complicated. I noted the time in the chart, 7:38 p.m., patient in supine position, monitoring equipment functioning normally, no change in LOC, turned off the light and moved on. The first 4 hours of the shift were ordinary to the point of tedium. A gentleman in 298 with a post-surgical infection that required wound care. A woman in 307 admitted with dehydration who woke up around 9 wanting ice chips. A teenager in 311 with a fractured tibia who was supposed to be sleeping but whom I kept finding on his phone, giving me the particular guilty look of someone caught doing exactly what they knew they shouldn't. These are the textures of an overnight shift on a medical floor. Familiar. Manageable. Real. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I went to check on room 302. I noticed it before I was fully through the door. Something was different about the shape of the figure in the bed. Elijah Thorne was not on his back. He was lying on his right side, facing the window, with his knees drawn up slightly and his hands tucked under his chin in the position of someone deeply, contentedly asleep. I stopped in the doorway. My first response was purely mundane. I thought I had made an error in my earlier notation, or that Claire Medina, the other RN on the floor who covered rooms 290 through 301, had been in and repositioned him without telling me. It seemed unlikely that a comatose patient would reposition himself, but not impossible in a lighter coma where some motor activity persists. Still, the most straightforward explanation. I checked the monitoring equipment. All normal. I noted the position change in the chart, added a question mark and the note will confirm with CM, and went to find Claire. She was at the nursing station filling out a medication log. I asked if she'd been in to check on Thorne in 302 in the last hour, whether she'd repositioned him. She looked up with the slightly puzzled expression of someone being asked something they don't quite understand. I haven't been in his room tonight, she said. He's yours. I was doing Mrs. Ferrara's dressing change until about 1, and I've been here since. I asked her if she was certain. I'm certain, she said. Why? I told her about the position change. She put down her pen. We looked at each other in the way that nurses sometimes do when something small and incongruous drops into the middle of an ordinary shift, not alarmed, not yet, but with a particular attention. Then. She said it was possible he had some preserved motor function that hadn't shown up in the neuro assessment, that it happened sometimes, and that I should flag it for the day physician in the morning. I agreed. I went back and checked on him. He was still on his right side. His cardiac monitor showed 52 beats per minute. His face, visible now in profile, was composed and still. I stood there for almost 4 minutes before I could make myself leave, and I'm still not entirely sure why. I wrote, 2:07 a.m., patient found in right lateral decubitus position, possible spontaneous repositioning, will discuss with attending. At 3:15, I went back. He was on his back again. I stood outside the door for a moment before I went in, which is something I have never done before in 11 years of nursing. I stood in the corridor and held onto the door frame and breathed, because something in my chest had tightened in a way I could not immediately explain. Then I pushed the door fully open and checked everything very methodically: cardiac monitor, pulse oximeter, blood pressure cuff, 4-line. 53 beats per minute. 97% saturation. Everything fine. He was on his back, hands folded on the blanket, in the exact position he'd been in at 7:30. The blanket was perfectly smooth. Not the smoothness of a blanket that has been straightened by a nurse. I know what that looks like, because I've done it thousands of times, and there's always a slight asymmetry, a fold deeper on one side. This was the smoothness of a blanket that had not been disturbed. As though he had not moved at all tonight and the 2 o'clock check had simply not happened. I went to the security office. It's a small room on the ground floor next to the loading dock, staffed overnight by a rotating cast of security personnel who spend most of their shift watching monitors. That night the guard was Dennis Farrow, who had worked at St. Jude for about 3 years and who was the kind of person you describe as unflappable the same way you describe water as wet. I asked if I could look at the corridor footage for the second floor. Dennis said sure, come on down. The security office smelled like burnt coffee and the mustiness of a room with no windows kept slightly too warm. Dennis had 3 monitors showing different feeds, the main entrance, the parking lot, and a cycling feed rotating through the interior cameras. I asked him to pull up the corridor outside room 302, and he clicked around until the right feed came up. The corridor appeared in the flat gray-green of institutional security camera footage, slightly grainy, timestamp running in the bottom right corner. Dennis scrolled back to around 2 o'clock. We watched the timestamp advance. At 2:03, I appeared on the screen, walking down the corridor toward 302. I watched myself push open the door and disappear inside. The corridor was empty. At 2:09 I emerged, made a note at the chart holder outside the door, and walked back toward the station. The door to 302 swung shut behind me. Between 2:09 and 3:15, the footage showed nothing. No one entering or leaving room 302. No movement at all. Just the flat gray-green stillness of the hallway. Then, at 3:02 a.m., 12 minutes before I'd gone back to check on him, the screen filled with static. Not a flicker, not a brief dropout of the kind that happens with old cameras when the connection is slightly loose. The whole frame became white noise, pure and absolute. It lasted for 11 seconds. I counted the timestamps in the corner, which continued to advance even through the white noise. When the picture came back, the corridor was the same. Same gray-green. Same empty hallway. Same closed door to room 302. I asked Dennis if this happened often. He said no. Could be an equipment issue, something interfering with the signal. He'd log it as a maintenance item. I asked him to go back to around the time of my first check, when Thorne would have been found in the supine position. At 1:47 a.m., the screen filled with static again. 9 seconds. Then cleared. We sat together and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then Dennis said, very carefully, "That's twice in one night." I said yes. I went back upstairs and finished my shift, and in the morning I flagged the neuro inconsistency for Dr. Walcott, the attending, who said she'd look at the chart and it was probably minor motor activity consistent with a lighter vegetative state. I drove home in the early gray morning of March 15th and sat in my car in the driveway for about 10 minutes before I went inside. I told myself it was over. I told myself I'd gotten worked up over nothing, over a coincidence and an equipment glitch and the particular paranoia that 3 in the morning tends to produce in even the most experienced overnight nurse. I told myself this convincingly enough to go to sleep. Then I went back the next night. The second night was colder. Not unusually cold for Vermont in March, it was still the kind of dark insular cold that settles over the valley when the false thaw everyone gets excited about in the first week turns out to be exactly that, a false thaw. But it was colder inside the hospital than it should have been. I noticed it when I walked in at 7, the lobby a good 2 or 3 degrees cooler than normal, and by the time I got upstairs it was noticeable enough that 2 of the day shift nurses mentioned it on their way out, something about the heating system in the East Wing cycling irregularly. By midnight, the second floor was genuinely cold in a way that felt less like a mechanical failure and more like the cold that comes when you leave a window open in February. The kind that gets into the bones of a building rather than just its air. There was something else as well, and this is where I am aware I risk losing credibility, so I want to be careful about how I describe it. The ventilation system in the East Wing had been producing a sound for the last hour that was not entirely unlike the sound of the radiators knocking. Not entirely unlike, but not quite the same. It was rhythmic in the wrong way. Not the irregular percussion of expanding metal in heating pipes but something more regular, more deliberate, with a rise and fall to it that I could not help but pattern recognize as something approaching speech. I am a pragmatic person. I told myself it was the ventilation system producing resonant harmonics through the ductwork, which is a real phenomenon I have read about. I told myself this and I went about my rounds. At 1:30 in the morning, I went to check room 302. I pushed the door open carefully. I want to note that I had started doing this, bracing myself before entering that room, which is a thing I still don't fully understand because Elijah Thorne was a comatose elderly man in a hospital bed who posed no rational threat to me or to anyone. The room was cold. Colder than the corridor, which was already colder than it should have been. I could see my breath. His blanket was hanging partially off the side of the bed. Not in the way it does when a patient shifts in their sleep and drags it with them, but in the way it does when something has been folded back deliberately and then left. I hesitated. Then I reached down and lifted the edge of the blanket, pulling it back toward the bed. The floor beneath the bed, the pale beige institutional tile that I had seen 1,000 times under 1,000 hospital beds, was marked. They were not deep cuts. They were the kind of marks that might have been made with something small and hard, a nail, a coin, a pen. But they covered an area of perhaps 2 feet by 3 feet, and they were dense, overlapping, intricate, the kind of marks that take time. Not random scratches. A system. A pattern. I had studied enough to recognize that they were not in any Roman-derived alphabet, not in Greek, not in anything I could immediately identify, though the forms of some of the symbols suggested an awareness of written language. There were elements that looked like they were meant to be read. Directions implied in their arrangement, a sense of order within the complexity. And in the center of the pattern, written in letters I recognized immediately because they were my own name, was the word Voss. My name. Margaret Voss. Spelled out in the same freshly made marks as the rest of the pattern, with no separation from the surrounding symbols except the recognition it produced in my chest like a dropped stone in still water. I stood up. I looked at Elijah Thorne, who was lying on his back in the center of the bed, hands folded, eyes closed, breathing at 14 breaths per minute. I looked at his hands. They were unmarked, no abrasions, no cuts, nothing to suggest he had been in contact with the floor. His foreline was intact. His nail beds were clean. I looked at the floor again. The slippers that I had noted in my earlier chart review as being stored in the bedside cabinet, gray foam slippers, standard issue, the kind St. Jude keeps in the admissions closet, were on the floor beside the bed. Not inside the cabinet. Right beside the bed, in the position they would be in if someone had stepped into them from the mattress. They were wet. I crouched down and touched one with 2 fingers, the way you'd test anything you weren't sure about touching. The foam was damp. Not just cool damp the way things get in a cold room, wet. The kind of wet that comes from outside, from rain or melted snow. I could smell it, a faint green smell like cold rain on pavement. I checked my phone for the weather. Clear and dry, 18 degrees Fahrenheit. No precipitation in the previous 24 hours. I went back to the nursing station. I did not run. I want to be clear about that, I did not run, because I have worked in hospitals for 11 years and there is a part of the nurse's training that insists, deeply and at a level below conscious thought, that panic is a response to be postponed and managed. I walked at a normal pace, sat down at the computer, and opened a new entry in Thorne's chart. I wrote, 1:34 a.m., found patient's personal slippers displaced from storage, positioned at bedside. Slippers appear damp. Noted markings on floor surface beneath bed, will photograph for documentation and report to charge nurse and attending. Patient in supine position, monitoring stable. Then I sat with my hands on the keyboard and did not move for a little while. I photographed the floor markings on my phone. I photographed the slippers. I called the charge nurse on duty, Phil Bateman, who came to the second floor at 2:15 and stood in the doorway of 302 and looked at the floor for a long time without saying anything. Phil Bateman has been a nurse for 19 years. He said, "That's not something I've seen before." He said he would note it and contact the attending in the morning. He said the maintenance team should look at the floor. He said I should probably photograph it again with the charge nurse as witness, which I did, and he countersigned the chart entry. He didn't say anything about my name in the middle of the symbols. I don't know if he noticed it. I didn't ask. I drove home in the morning of the 16th and did not sleep. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the photographs on my phone. My name was clearly visible in the center of the pattern. The letters were slightly larger than the surrounding symbols, and they were oriented so they would be readable from a standing position looking down at the bed, readable, specifically, to anyone standing beside the bed checking on the patient. Standing where I stood. I went back on the 17th. I know that sounds impossible. I know the rational response, the response anyone reading this will immediately propose, is to refuse the assignment, to call in sick, to do anything other than go back to that hospital and that floor and that room. But the impulse to refuse felt equally irrational, felt like the kind of overcorrection that ends careers because you can't explain why you wouldn't go back. I told myself I had found disturbing. Markings on a floor and wet slippers without a clear explanation, and these things, while genuinely unexplained, were not inherently dangerous. I told myself this enough times to believe it enough to drive to work. The third night was the coldest. Not the building this time, the building had been fixed, some valve in the heating system that maintenance had corrected over the course of the day, and the temperature when I walked in was normal. The cold was different. It was the kind of cold that doesn't have a source, the kind you feel in rooms that have been empty too long. When I did my 7:30 check, I noticed it immediately. Room 302 was noticeably cooler than the corridor, and the differential only increased as the night went on. By midnight I could see my breath again. The heating vent was blowing warm air. I checked, put my hand up to it, but the room was cold. Elijah Thorne's vitals were unchanged. Cardiac monitor, steady. Oxygen saturation, normal. Blood pressure, unremarkable. He lay on his back in the center of the bed and did not move and did not respond and looked, as he had for the previous 2 nights, like a man profoundly, architecturally absent from himself. At 11 p.m., I decided to leave the door open. I have been trying, in retrospect, to reconstruct exactly what I was thinking when I made that decision, and the honest answer is that I am not entirely sure. I told myself it was standard practice for patients whose status might change. I told myself it would allow me to hear any change in the monitors without entering the room. Both of these things were true. But they were not why I did it. I did it because I did not want to enter that room in the dark and find him somewhere he should not be. I positioned myself at the station desk so that I had a partial sight line down the corridor toward the open door. I charted. I medicated. I responded to call lights. And I watched. At 1:47 in the morning, I saw it. He was in the bed. The corridor light was falling through the open door and reaching just far enough to show the foot of the bed, the shape of the blanket, the foot end of the mattress. And the shape under the blanket was moving. Not the way a sleeping person moves. Not a shift or an adjustment. The shape was changing in a way that suggested the frame producing it was rearranging itself at a fundamental level. I watched the outline under the blanket change, and I watched the blanket pull tight and then go slack and then pull tight again in a different direction, and I heard, from 40 feet down the corridor, with 11 rooms and all the ambient noise of a hospital floor between me and it, I heard a sound that I can only describe as the sound of something large and dry snapping. The way a greenwood branch breaks versus a dead one. The sound of something that has some give in it but not quite enough. I stood up from the desk. I don't remember making the decision to stand up. The blanket at the foot of the bed was rising. Not being pushed by feet, rising, vertically, in a way that suggested something beneath it was no longer lying flat. The shape was no longer horizontal. The shape was ascending in the center, a tent pole under cloth, but the tent pole was moving, articulating, bending in ways that I cannot describe without using the word impossible. I am a person who understands the human body very well. I know what the human spine can and cannot do. I know the range of motion of every major joint. I know what the surface of a body looks like under cloth when the body beneath it moves in the ways that bodies can move. What I was seeing through the open door of room 302 was not that. The digital clock on the wall above the nursing station read 1:52 a.m. Then it read 1:51. Then 1:50. Then 1:49. I turned and looked at the clock in the break room at the end of the corridor, which was also digital. It read 1:52. Then 1:51. Then 1:50. I looked at the clock on my phone. 1:52, then my phone read 1:51. I have no explanation for this. Every digital display on the second floor of St. Jude Memorial Hospital was counting backward. I did not run. I walked, at a measured pace, to room 302. I had my flashlight in my hand, the small clinical flashlight I carry for pupillary response checks, and I was holding it the way you hold something when you need to hold something, not because you need the light but because you need to be holding something. I walked to the doorway and clicked on the flashlight and shone it into the room. The bed was empty. Not disarrayed, not disturbed in the way of a room where a patient has gotten up. Empty in the way of a bed that has been made. The blanket was pulled up and smoothed flat and the pillow was at the top and the sheets were tucked at the corners. The 4 poles stood beside the empty bed. The drip bag still hung from it, still 3/4 full of normal saline, the drip chamber beneath it still showing the slow metronomic fall of drops into the solution below. The 4 line ran from the bag down the pole and curved out in the natural arc of tubing and ended, hanging free, in midair beside the bed. The cannula that had been in the back of Elijah Thorne's left hand was not on the floor. It was not on the bed. The line simply ended in open air, and the tip of it was dry. I stood in the doorway. I moved the flashlight around the room, corners, the bathroom alcove, the window, the floor. The floor was clear. The symbols and my name from 2 nights ago were gone. The cabinet where the slippers had been was open, the slippers inside, dry. I heard something then. What I heard was coming through the intercom speaker on the wall of room 302, the intercom that connects patient rooms to the nursing station, a system that is push-to-talk and that can only be activated from the nursing station and by a nurse pressing a button on the console. The speaker crackled. And then there was a sound, coming through a hospital intercom at 1:50-something a.m. while the digital clocks on the floor counted backward, that I can only describe as laughter, but stretched wrong, processed wrong, the way a familiar sound sounds when it has been slowed down significantly so that you can hear the mechanisms usually hidden beneath the surface, the breath and the pulse and the underlying structures. I turned toward the window. The window of room 302 faces the parking lot and, beyond it, the tree line of the Harwick State Forest, which in March at 2 in the morning is an absolute darkness punctuated only by the distant orange glow of parking lot lights on the snow. The window glass, with the interior of the room reflected in it, functions as a mirror at night. I was looking at my reflection. I know what I look like. I have looked at my own face for 39 years. The face in the window was mine, same dark hair pulled back, same light blue scrubs, same flashlight held in the right hand. Directly behind my reflection, there was another figure. He was tall. He was standing close enough that in my reflection he appeared to be within arm's reach of me. The white hair swept back from the high forehead. The broad shoulders. The face that I had only ever seen slack and unresponsive, face up in a hospital bed, now arranged differently, upright, eyes open, the deep-set eyes and that architectural face looking at me through the glass with an expression I cannot adequately characterize except to say that it was not the expression of an elderly man who has woken up confused in an unfamiliar place. I turned around. The room was empty. The flashlight beam moved across every corner. The bathroom alcove. The space between the bed and the wall. The door to the corridor. I turned back to the window. My reflection was there. The reflection of the empty room behind me, the four-pole, the floating end of the tubing. The reflection of me began, very slowly, very deliberately, to raise its right hand. I was not raising my hand. I was standing completely still with the flashlight at my side, and I watched my reflection raise its hand to the collar of my scrubs, and I watched the reflection's fingers find the edge of the fabric there, and I watched what the reflection did next for approximately 3 seconds before something in me that was below and older than thought simply could not continue watching. I turned and I walked out of room 302 and I walked down the corridor to the nursing station and I picked up the phone and I called Phil Bateman in the ICU wing and I told him that patient Elijah Thorne in room 302 was no longer in his bed and I needed assistance. Phil came. We searched the room, the corridor, both bathrooms on the floor, the stairwell exits, the elevator. We called security. Dennis Farrow walked the perimeter of the building in the cold and found nothing. Dr. Walcott was paged and came in at 4 a.m., and there were conversations and incident reports and a call to Thorne's daughter in Portland and a call to the county sheriff's office because a missing patient is a missing person. I wrote in the incident report what I could account for factually: patient not found in room at approximately 1:58 a.m., for line found disconnected, no sign of patient in facility or on surrounding grounds. I did not write about the window. I did not write about the clocks. The Harwick County Sheriff's Office has been searching the Harwick State Forest since the morning of the 18th. As of the last update I received, which was this past Thursday, they have found no trace of Elijah Thorne. The notebook that was found on his person when he was admitted, the one containing the unidentified script, was logged into his personal effects and stored in the patient property room on the ground floor. When hospital administration went to retrieve it for the investigation, it was not there. The log shows it as received. No one signed it out. I am on administrative leave while the incident is reviewed, which is standard procedure. I have been cooperative. I have answered all questions accurately within the scope of what I have disclosed. I went back to St. Jude yesterday. Not to work, I am on leave, but because I had left my car charger in my locker and I needed to pick it up. I went in through the main entrance and took the elevator to the second floor and walked to the staff locker room and got my charger. Then I walked back to the elevator. I passed room 302 on the way. The door was closed. The room is still unassigned pending completion of the incident review. I should not have stopped. I know I should not have stopped. I stopped and I put my hand on the door and I stood there for a moment. And from the other side of the door, clearly and without any possibility of misattribution, I heard the sound of something moving in that room. Not a person, not footsteps, not the creak of a mattress. The sound of something moving across the surface of the tiled floor. A slow, deliberate dragging sound, like something being inscribed. I did not open the door. I walked to the elevator and I pressed the button and I waited and I got in and I rode it to the lobby and I walked out into the parking lot and got in my car and drove home. The door that wasn't there is the last thing I keep coming back to. The door of room 302 in my memory of that night, I remember walking out of it. I remember the act of walking through a doorway. But when I try to see the door itself, the specific door with the standard institutional handle and the chart holder on the wall beside it, when I try to see it as a thing that was there as I left the room, I cannot do it. There is a gap. There is the room and then there is the corridor and there is nothing in between that I can actually see, just a white space where the door should be, white and featureless like a wall that has always been there, like a place that has never had any opening at all. Last night I woke up at 3 in the morning. I became aware that I did not know what position I was in. Which sounds like a strange thing to not know, but there was a moment, brief, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, but real, when I could not locate my body in space the way you usually can even in deep darkness, when the proprioceptive certainty of where your limbs are simply was not there. I was just consciousness without coordinates. It passed. I found myself again, located in my bed, on my left side, in my bedroom in my house in Harwick, Vermont. But in those 2 or 3 seconds, in the dark before I found myself, there was something. A quality to the absence of self-location that I can only describe as a sense of being observed. Of there being something that knew exactly where I was, even when I did not. I got up and turned on every light in the house. I have not turned them off. I'm writing this because I have to write it somewhere. I don't know what I saw. I don't know what moved in that room or made those marks or wore those slippers on a dry night. I don't know where Elijah Thorne went or how he got there or what he was doing in the Harwick State Forest in the first place, 1.5 miles off the marked trail, in the dark, without his gear, with a notebook full of symbols no one can identify. I know that my name was on that floor. I know that the clocks ran backward. I know what I did not see in the window when I turned around, and I know what I did see in the window before I turned. I have not looked in a mirror since the night of the 17th. I'm working on it.